The wedding bells echoed faintly across the grand, towering cathedral, their sound a sweet melody that seemed to promise nothing but joy. The lavish setting, draped in ivory and gold, shimmered under the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. The air was thick with anticipation, as guests, elegantly dressed in their finest, whispered excitedly among themselves. This was to be a wedding like no other, a celebration of wealth, status, and beauty. At the back of the church, seated in the farthest corner, was a figure who, despite the grandeur surrounding her, seemed like a shadow in the light. An elderly woman, her skin dark and weathered by time, sat in a simple yet dignified dress. Her silver hair, tied back in a neat bun, gave her an air of quiet strength. Beside her was a small dog, scruffy and nervous, with a look of loyalty that reflected the bond between them. The dog's eyes scanned the room, and every so often its ears perked up in response to the sounds of hushed laughter and whispered comments. She was far from home, in a world that did not welcome her. The others in the church, perfectly coiffed and adorned in designer gowns and suits, hardly spared a second glance at the old woman. Her presence seemed like a mistake in this world of wealth and perfection. The eyes that occasionally flickered her way were not ones of warmth or inclusion, but of condescension. It was as if she didn't belong here, in this place of high society and opulence. The woman's name was Grace, but the invitation she had received, a simple envelope with embossed letters, felt more like an afterthought than a genuine invitation. A seat at the back, the note had said, as though the sender couldn't quite bring themselves to offer her any more. Still, Grace had made the journey, walking slowly with her dog by her side, feeling the weight of years on her shoulders, but also a sense of quiet pride. She had been invited after all, and that meant something, or so she had hoped. Around her, the guests continued to chatter, oblivious to the woman in the corner. But Grace had long learned to navigate such moments, how to blend in, how to remain unnoticed, how to swallow the quiet sting of exclusion. She had grown accustomed to being invisible, to feeling like the background noise in a world that didn't want to hear her. But even as she sat there, with the wedding procession about to begin, Grace couldn't help but feel the flickers of something darker stir within her. Something just beneath the surface, like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, threatening to break free. She knew what they thought of her, what they thought of people like her. She had heard the whispers when she entered, the soft giggles of the young women who sat near the aisle, the side glances from men who didn't know what to make of her presence. And then it happened. A young woman, her face painted with a smile so bright it seemed artificial, glanced over at Grace. The smile on her lips was one of polite curiosity, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Who invited her?" the woman muttered, just loud enough for those around her to hear. "She doesn't belong here." The laughter that followed was light, almost teasing, but it struck like a slap. Grace felt her heart tighten, but she didn't react. Not yet. She had learned long ago to let such things wash over her. She looked at her dog, and for a moment the weight of her years and the sting of exclusion disappeared. But the moment didn't last long. Another voice, a man this time, leaned over to his companion. "Can you imagine the nerve of some people? A poor, old black woman thinking she belongs at a wedding like this. She's probably just here for the free food." The words, like daggers, cut through the air. Grace's grip on her dog tightened, her knuckles white. The dog, sensing the shift in her emotions, whimpered softly. Grace's heart beat faster now, but she refused to let the anger rise. Not yet. She stared at the floor, taking a deep breath. The wedding was about to begin, but for Grace, the real story of this day had already started. The crowd would get their moment of celebration. But what they didn't realize was that they were about to witness something they could never have expected. Something that would change everything. The stage was set. The tension hung thick in the air. Grace was about to show them that sometimes the most unexpected person can be the one who holds the power to upend everything. The first of many surprises had just been delivered, and this wedding was about to take a turn no one would ever forget. The wedding ceremony began with all the pomp and splendor that one would expect from an event of such magnitude. The doors opened wide, revealing the bride, a vision of perfection in her white satin gown, gliding down the aisle with the grace of a princess. Her parents, beaming with pride, walked beside her, faces glowing under the soft lights. Guests stood, some clapping, others whispering to one another, admiring the scene before them. The air was thick with admiration, joy, and a sense of invulnerability. Yet, in the far corner of the room, at the back of the church, Grace remained seated, invisible, like a ghost drifting between worlds, watching, absorbing the beauty around her, yet painfully excluded from it. The soft whispers that once circled around her had now died down, replaced by a thick silence that seemed to swallow everything. The room, filled with the collective awe of a grand wedding, had no space for someone like her. She could feel it in every glance that briefly rested on her, in every small, judgmental look cast from the corner of an eye. As the bride and groom exchanged vows, Grace's mind wandered. She hadn't expected to be treated like royalty. She had no illusions about her place in society. But what stung, what always stung, was the way people looked at her, the way they acted as though she were invisible, or worse, like she didn't belong. Her fingers trembled, gripping the edge of her seat. The dog beside her, sensing her growing tension, nestled closer, offering comfort in its silence. Grace wasn't sure if the dog could sense the anger bubbling up inside her, but it didn't matter. It was a strange comfort, the dog's presence. It reminded her that she was still human, that she was still a person with her own story, her own dignity. The ceremony continued, but the whispering didn't stop. "She doesn't belong here," one of the younger bridesmaids hissed, her words barely audible but sharp enough to pierce the quiet of the church. Grace didn't look at her. She couldn't. She knew the look the girl would wear, the face of faux politeness that masked contempt. It was nothing new. This was her life, after all, a constant dance with discomfort, a performance of patience that she had perfected over decades. Her eyes flickered over the guests, watching their subtle movements, the way they held themselves as though they were too good for her, too above her. A sharp laugh came from a group of women seated near the front, their voices too loud, too insistent. Grace caught a few words. "Do you see her?" one woman murmured, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How did she even get an invite to this? Someone must have made a mistake." Grace felt the sting of those words deep in her chest, though she did not show it. "They probably thought it would be charming to have a token person of colour," another voice added, far too loud, far too careless. "It's so trendy, isn't it? To have diversity in these settings." The words were harsh, cutting through the otherwise quiet hum of the ceremony. Grace remained still, her face a mask of calm, but the bile in her throat rose, threatening to choke her. They were right in a way. She was the token, the charity case, the one who was supposed to smile and stay quiet, to be grateful for the scraps of attention thrown her way. But Grace wasn't in the mood for gratitude anymore. She had swallowed too much of it for too long. The bitterness of the remarks, of the snide comments about her presence, began to fester inside her. She could feel it stirring, the quiet rage that had been building for years, the injustice, the hurt, the cruel dismissal of her humanity. It all boiled inside her now. She looked down at her hands, the knuckles white from gripping the seat. She had never let herself be broken by others' cruelty, not completely. But tonight something was different. She had endured this type of treatment, this quiet racism for so long, but the moment had come. She was done with being silent. Grace's mind snapped back to the present as she heard a voice behind her, too loud, too drunk. "Is that your dog?" a man asked, his tone one of mockery. His laughter followed, thick and stifled with the arrogance of someone who thought they could say whatever they wanted without consequence. Grace turned slowly, her gaze cold. The man, with his perfectly groomed beard and pristine suit, smirked at her, waiting for her reaction, enjoying the power he thought he held over her. His eyes flicked to the dog, which was now standing with its tail between its legs, sensing the shift in the air. "Who brings a dog to a wedding?" he sneered, clearly savouring the discomfort he was causing. Grace didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just stared at him. The silence between them thickened. "I brought my dog," she said, her voice steady but hard. "What's it to you?" The man's smirk faltered for a moment, and the surrounding guests glanced over, sensing the tension in the air. But he quickly recovered, throwing his head back and laughing. "Isn't she a feisty one?" he chuckled, his laughter spilling over the air, hitting everyone nearby. His voice carried through the room, a clear invitation for others to join in. A few guests chuckled awkwardly, but most were too afraid to laugh openly. They knew better than to engage in an open confrontation with Grace. She wasn't just any old woman, not just some figure to laugh at. Grace had an aura about her, something raw and unyielding that made even the most arrogant step back just a little. But the man wasn't done. He leaned in closer, looking down at her with condescension. "You know, I bet they didn't invite you for your company," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Bet they just wanted to check the diversity box, didn't they? You're just here to make the numbers look good. And your dog, well, maybe he's the real star of the show. They probably thought it would make you quaint. How charming, right?" There it was again, the unmistakable sting of racism, the blatant dismissal of her value as a person, as if she were just an accessory to the event, a symbol of something they could never truly understand. Grace's jaw tightened. She fought the urge to react, but it was impossible to stay silent. Not this time, not anymore. Her voice cut through the noise like a knife. "You're wrong," she said, her words calm but seething with an intensity that made the man pause. "I'm not here to make you feel better about yourselves. I'm not here for your approval. I didn't come to play your game." The man opened his mouth to speak, but Grace didn't wait for him. She stood up, slowly, deliberately, making her way to the center of the room. The guests around her fell silent, their eyes tracking her every movement. She could feel their gaze, heavy and judgmental, but she held her head high. The groom and bride, standing at the altar, exchanged nervous glances, sensing the disruption, but unsure of how to handle it. "I came here because I was invited," Grace continued, her voice rising now, filling the space. "And I'm going to stand here and tell you all something you need to hear. You think I don't belong here. You think because I'm older, because I'm black, because I'm poor, that I don't deserve the same respect as anyone else in this room. You think I'm just a charity case, a token. But you're wrong. I've lived my life, and I've earned my place in this world." There was a moment of stunned silence. The guests, who had been whispering and snickering just moments before, were now speechless, unable to fully comprehend what was happening. Grace turned to the man who had mocked her earlier. His face had gone pale, his smile wiped away, replaced by a nervous tension. "You think I'm here because of charity?" she asked, her voice dripping with irony. "No, I'm here because I refuse to be invisible. And if that bothers you, if you can't handle my presence, then maybe it's you who doesn't belong here." And with that, Grace turned and walked back to her seat, the eyes of every guest following her. The tension in the air was palpable, thick enough to cut through. The wedding, which had once seemed to sparkle with perfection, now felt unfinished. A beautiful facade that had just cracked open. Grace sat back down, her heart still pounding, but a quiet satisfaction blooming inside her. She had made her point. Now it was time to see if anyone would hear her. The room was charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. The wedding ceremony, which had been filled with beauty and elegance only moments ago, now felt suffocating, the air thick with discomfort, judgment, and a sharp edge of something darker. Grace's words had hit like a thunderclap in the stillness, shattering the carefully constructed atmosphere. It was as though the world had shifted, and now everyone, from the bride's proud parents to the smug guests seated near the front, had been forced to confront something they didn't want to see. As Grace settled back into her seat, the dog curled at her feet. The silence around her seemed almost deafening. She could feel their eyes, the silent questions that darted from one face to the next. Was she really serious? How dare she challenge the social order, the unspoken rules that kept people like her in their place? But the silence wasn't just directed at Grace. It was the uncomfortable kind of silence that settles in when a truth is spoken, a truth that no one wants to hear, but everyone feels. Across the room, the bride, standing at the altar, exchanged a quick look with her groom. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of surprise mixed with something else. Something resembling fear. The groom, on the other hand, had a different reaction. His face was flushed with embarrassment, but it wasn't for the reason one might think. It wasn't because of the ruckus or Grace's outburst. It was because deep down, he had always known that people like Grace didn't belong in this world. People like Grace were anomalies, deviations from the ideal image that his wedding, his life, was supposed to portray. He wasn't the only one who felt that way. The guests near the front, The ones whose whispered judgments had already cut through the air like a hot knife, now looked around nervously, unsure of what to do next. They had all been complicit in the social dynamics that had kept people like Grace on the outside, tucked away in the corners where they couldn't upset the delicate balance of their perfect world. They had all participated in the silent exclusion, in the quiet yet pervasive racism that ruled their interactions. But now, in the wake of her bold defiance, Grace had forced them to see what they had been too comfortable to acknowledge before. The man who had mocked her earlier, the one who had sneered at her dog and made his cruel remarks, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing over at his companions as if seeking validation. But none came. The women who had whispered about Grace's invitation, their eyes now darted to the floor, their faces flushed with embarrassment. The atmosphere, once so full of smiles and laughter, had turned cold. Grace's voice, though calm and steady, had shattered the illusion of their perfect world. It was the kind of discomfort that no one knew how to navigate, the kind of discomfort that makes people question their place in the world. And yet, despite the tension that hung in the air, despite the judgment and whispers, Grace remained calm. She didn't feel the need to justify herself further. She had already spoken her truth. It was up to them to process it, to reflect on the discomfort she had just laid bare. The ceremony had been completely derailed. The officiant, a well-dressed man in his 50s who had been officiating weddings for decades, stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. He had never experienced anything like this before. Weddings, after all, were meant to be joyous occasions, a place where the social order was reaffirmed, not challenged. But there was no ignoring the reality now. Grace's presence, her challenge, had unraveled the carefully constructed facade. The guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as though the chairs themselves had become too small for their bodies. The murmur of voices picked up again, but it was different now, more hesitant, more guarded. Some began to whisper, some looking back at Grace, others desperately trying to pretend that nothing had happened. But deep down, everyone felt it. The tension was too palpable, too undeniable to ignore. And then, as if to break the silence, one of the bridesmaids, a young woman with blonde hair and a laugh that could light up a room, stood up abruptly, her voice pitched high in anger. "Who does she think she is?" the bridesmaid snapped, glaring at Grace across the room. "She's just some old woman, and she has no business making a scene like that. How dare she?" Her words sliced through the air, venomous and sharp, but they were not as effective as she had hoped. The guests who had been gossiping before fell silent, unsure of how to react. The groom's face reddened, but he said nothing. His discomfort was palpable, but he too seemed caught in the current of the moment, unable to steer the ship back to its intended course. Grace, however, was unfazed. She had expected this, the backlash, the outrage, the denial that always followed when someone dared to step outside the line they had been placed in. People like her, people who didn't fit into the neat, preordained categories of society, were meant to be seen and not heard. They were meant to be grateful for the scraps of attention thrown their way, not to claim space, not to challenge the comfort of those who had always held the power. "I don't need your approval," Grace said, her voice ringing out clear and steady. "And I'm not here for your comfort. I'm here because I deserve to be." The bridesmaid's face turned crimson with anger, but the sharpness in Grace's voice left her speechless. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time had frozen, the room holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. And then the groom's mother, a woman whose every word and gesture had always been perfectly polished, perfectly controlled, stood up. Her expression was icy, her eyes narrow with disdain. "Perhaps you should leave," she said, her voice cold and clipped. "This is a celebration and your behavior is inappropriate." Grace turned slowly toward the woman. The words, so calculated, so patronizing, were meant to dismiss her, to make her feel small, insignificant. But Grace didn't flinch. She had been dismissed her entire life. She had been made to feel less than, to feel as though she didn't matter. But tonight, she was done. "I'm not going anywhere," Grace said, her voice low but resolute. "This is my right to be here. I wasn't invited out of charity, and I'm not leaving because you say so." The tension in the room reached a boiling point, but just as it seemed that things might escalate, the bride, who had been silent throughout the exchange, stepped forward. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was something in her expression that wasn't just fear. It was something deeper. She wasn't just scared of Grace. She was scared of what Grace represented. The bride took a deep breath and looked directly at Grace. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice small. "This isn't how I imagined today would go." The words were hesitant, unsure. Grace could see the bride's discomfort, but also something else. A flicker of understanding, a realization. The bride, like everyone else in the room, had been complicit in the social structures that had kept people like Grace in the margins. But now, faced with Grace's strength and defiance, she saw something different. "I'm sorry," the bride said quietly, the apology coming not just for the moment, but for the hurt that had been inflicted upon Grace by the very system they were all a part of. And just like that, the room shifted. The tension didn't dissolve. It was still there, still thick in the air, but something had changed. Grace had done what no one else had dared to do. She had forced the room to face its own discomfort, its own prejudice, and now they could no longer pretend it wasn't there. The wedding, which had started as a celebration, had turned into a reckoning. The masks were off, and no one could pretend anymore. The real work, the hard work of confronting the ugliness beneath the surface, had only just begun, and Grace, for the first time in her life, felt the power of being seen. The quiet storm that had been brewing inside her had finally broken, and there was no going back. Let's take a short pause here. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you listening to our stories from? Have you ever experienced something similar in your life? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe for more. Now let's continue. The air in the room was thick with unspoken words, like a silent storm waiting to break. The apology from the bride had lingered, hanging in the air between Grace and the rest of the guests, like a half-hearted gesture, an acknowledgement of the discomfort, but not the problem itself. People were still processing the events, some shocked, some unwilling to confront the reality that Grace had so effortlessly exposed. The guests, who had once been so poised in their designer clothes, were now subtly looking around, wondering what came next. Grace, however, felt no need to address the apology further. She had already spoken her truth. She had already made her stand, and the room was left to deal with the consequences of its own ignorance. What she did next was as unexpected as her earlier defiance. She sat down again, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. Her dog, sensing the change in the atmosphere, lay quietly at her feet. The officiant, still stunned by the disruption, cleared his throat awkwardly. The wedding ceremony, once flowing with ceremonial precision, had come to a screeching halt. Guests exchanged glances, some silently urging the officiant to continue, while others were too uncomfortable to move. The bride, still standing at the altar, looked like she might faint from the tension in the room. But Grace's calmness had shifted the power dynamic in the room. It wasn't the bride or groom who now commanded attention. It was Grace. Her presence was undeniable. The harsh words that had been thrown at her before had ricocheted back, embedding themselves in the minds of the people around her, forcing them to confront their own biases, and no one was left unscathed. Let's continue," the officiant stammered, attempting to regain control of the situation. But it was clear that the moment had passed. The air was no longer filled with the reverence of a wedding. It was thick with the weight of uncomfortable truths, and no one knew how to return to the celebration they had all planned. As the ceremony finally trudged on, the guests' reactions were mixed. Some were trying to return to their polished personas, pretending as if nothing had happened, but it was impossible. Grace's words, her challenge to the social order, had planted a seed in the minds of everyone present. The carefully constructed walls of their privileged lives had cracked, and no amount of forced smiles or polite conversation could put them back together. At one point, a group of women seated near the front began to whisper, their eyes casting furtive glances in Grace's direction. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as they tried to make sense of the disruption. Some, like the bridesmaid who had first spoken out against Grace, seemed to be searching for validation, a way to reclaim the control they had lost when Grace had stood up to them. "Can you believe her?" one of them whispered. "She just walked in here and acted like she owned the place. I mean, who does that?" Another woman, her voice laced with disdain, added, "I knew it. She's nothing but a bitter old woman. She's just mad she wasn't invited to a real wedding." The words stung, but Grace didn't react. She had long since stopped expecting kindness or understanding from people who were so determined to keep her in a box. She had heard it all before, the whispers, the snide remarks, the judgments. But what they didn't understand was that their words no longer held power over her. And then, as though sensing the growing unrest, the groom's father, a towering figure with an air of self-importance, stood up from his seat and walked over to Grace. His heavy footsteps echoed through the room, drawing the eyes of everyone present. "Excuse me," he said, his voice low but firm. "I think it's time for you to leave." His tone wasn't kind or apologetic. It was cold, laced with a sense of superiority that could only come from a man who believed the world was meant to revolve around him. Grace looked up at him, her expression unreadable. The audacity of his words, the assumption that he could dictate her presence here, took her aback, but only for a moment. She had heard this kind of dismissal her entire life. People who felt entitled to everything, people who believed that their wealth and status gave them the right to tell others where they belonged. "I'm not going anywhere," Grace said, her voice calm, but there was a steeliness in her words that made it clear she wasn't backing down. The groom's father scowled, clearly irritated by the challenge. He took a step closer, his imposing figure casting a shadow over Grace. "You don't belong here," he sneered. "This is a celebration, not a place for someone like you." The words hit harder than anything that had been said before. They were loaded with all the subtle, insidious racism that had been festering in this room from the moment Grace had walked in. It wasn't just about class or wealth. It was about race, about the notion that someone like Grace, someone who was older, poorer, and black, had no place in their world. Grace stood up slowly, her gaze unwavering. Her heart pounded in her chest, but her voice didn't waver. "You're right," she said softly. "I don't belong here, but neither do you." The room went silent. Every eye in the room turned toward her, some in shock, others in disbelief. The groom's father opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. For the first time in his life, someone had challenged him, had dared to question his entitlement. But Grace wasn't finished. She looked around the room, her eyes meeting those of the other guests. "You're all the same," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "You sit here, pretending to celebrate love, but all you really celebrate is the power you have over others. You look at me, and you see nothing but a woman who doesn't belong. You see my age, my skin, my poverty, and you think that means I'm not worthy. But let me tell you something. You've spent your whole lives building walls around yourselves, and I'm here to show you that those walls don't protect you, they only imprison you." There was a long pause, a moment when no one knew what to say. The guests were paralyzed by her words, by the truth they had been avoiding for so long. The groom's father stood there, his face a mix of anger and confusion. He had never been spoken to this way. Never had anyone dared to challenge his authority. But Grace wasn't afraid. She had nothing to lose anymore. She had spent her entire life fighting to be seen, to be heard. And now, in this moment, she was finally making her voice count. The silence stretched on, and the tension in the room was almost unbearable. But in that moment, something shifted. A few of the guests, the ones who had been quietly observing the exchange, seemed to stir. They had seen the truth in Grace's words, and it made them uncomfortable. It made them question their own complicity in the systems that had kept people like Grace on the outside. But the moment was fleeting. As quickly as the shift had come, it was gone. The groom's father stepped back, his face flushed with fury, but he said nothing. He couldn't. For the first time, someone had stood up to him and made him realize that the world wasn't as simple as he had always believed. Grace turned away, her gaze moving to the bride, who was still standing at the altar, her eyes wide with disbelief. The bride, in that moment, seemed lost, caught between the social pressures that had defined her life and the reality that Grace had forced her to face. Grace gave her a small, knowing smile. She didn't need the bride's approval. She didn't need anyone's approval. For once, she was standing in her own truth, and that was enough. The ceremony, which had once been filled with so much promise, now felt like a distant memory. The celebration was over, and all that remained was the uncomfortable truth that had been exposed, raw and unrelenting. And in that silence, Grace knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The silence that had followed Grace's words was palpable, thick like the suffocating weight of unresolved history. The guests, once so poised in their perfect outfits, now seemed like characters in a play that had gone off script. The laughter and chatter that had filled the room earlier had evaporated, leaving only a stifling tension behind. The groom's father stood in the center of the room, his chest heaving with unspoken rage, but his face was carefully composed, as though he were trying to regain control of the situation. He looked from Grace to the bride, then back at the guests, as if searching for someone to take charge, someone to offer him a solution to the mess she had created. But no one moved. No one dared. The world he had known, where people like Grace stayed in their place and kept quiet, had been shattered. Grace, undeterred by the tension she had caused, turned her attention back to the front of the room. The bride, still standing at the altar, looked as though she might faint. Her eyes darted between Grace and the other guests, her hands trembling in her lap. The groom, standing beside her, looked more annoyed than concerned, as if his wedding day had been ruined by the uninvited disruption. The truth was, this wedding had always been about much more than just two people coming together in love. It had been a spectacle, a carefully curated event designed to showcase the power, wealth, and status of everyone involved. It was a performance, and like any performance, the cast had been carefully chosen. People like Grace, people from the fringes, had no place in this carefully constructed world. They were supposed to stay invisible, stay silent, and stay grateful. But Grace wasn't going to play by those rules. She had lived too long in a world that saw her as nothing more than a pawn, a side character in someone else's story. And now, for the first time, she was taking center stage. The guests, those who were still trying to preserve the semblance of a good time, began to whisper among themselves. The quiet murmur of voices was like a wave crashing against the walls, the tension thickening with each passing second. Some tried to ignore what had happened, shifting in their seats, pretending it hadn't touched them. But the truth was undeniable. Grace had shaken them. She had dared to challenge their world, to expose the fragile nature of the society they had built. "Who does she think she is?" one voice hissed from the back of the room. The harshness of the comment caused a ripple of discomfort, but it wasn't enough to break the silence. The words hung in the air, poisoning the space between them. The woman who had spoken was clearly uncomfortable, trying to reassert some sort of power that she had lost when Grace had spoken so freely. "Someone should have told her she doesn't belong here," another voice muttered. This time it was a man's voice, a deep, throaty sound that carried through the room. "She's a disgrace." The words were carefully crafted, designed to belittle, to push Grace back into her place. But they didn't land where they had hoped. Grace's gaze, as cold and unyielding as steel, swept over the room. She had heard it all before. The whispers, the mockery, the assumptions that she was less than. She knew what people thought of her, of people like her. It was the same everywhere. But Grace had learned to turn those words into fuel. "Disgrace," Grace repeated, her voice sharp but measured, each syllable cutting through the tension. "No, what's truly disgraceful is the way you all sit here, pretending that your wealth and privilege give you the right to dictate who belongs and who doesn't." The room fell silent once again. Grace's words were like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown down at the feet of those who had believed their power and status would protect them forever. The groom's father, his face twisted with anger, took a step forward, but before he could speak, Grace cut him off. "You think you can silence me with your money, your power, your influence? You think you can bury the truth with your carefully constructed lives? No, I'm not leaving, not until you all see the truth for what it is." Her words rang out like a declaration of war. She wasn't just challenging a room of strangers. She was challenging a system that had been built to oppress people like her for generations. And in that moment, Grace wasn't just standing up for herself. She was standing up for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, every person who had been excluded, pushed aside, or made to feel less than. The guests, at first hesitant, began to stir. Some shuffled uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes flicking between Grace and the people around them. Others crossed their arms, leaning back, clearly displeased with the direction things were taking. There were a few who seemed to want to leave, their discomfort too much to bear, but no one moved. They were stuck in this moment, caught between their old world certainties and the unsettling new reality that Grace had brought to light. A woman at the back of the room, her voice dripping with contempt, muttered, "You're just a bitter old woman who doesn't know her place. You've made this about you. And now you've ruined everything." Grace's eyes locked on the woman, and for a moment the room was still. The accusation was so typical, so predictable. The attempt to paint her as an outsider, as someone who was simply throwing a tantrum. It was the oldest trick in the book. When people like Grace speak out, when they refuse to stay silent, they're written off as bitter, angry, or irrelevant. It was an easy way to dismiss her, but Grace had no intention of letting that narrative stand. "I'm not bitter," she said softly, but her words carried with the weight of everything she had endured in her life. "I'm not angry. I'm just tired of pretending to be something I'm not for your comfort." The woman fell silent, the words hanging in the air like a challenge she wasn't prepared to meet. Around the room, the murmurs started again, but now they were different. They weren't whispers of dismissal. They were whispers of unease, of realization that maybe, just maybe, Grace was right. The groom's mother, still standing near the altar, looked at the bride, her expression one of frustration and disappointment. "This isn't how it's supposed to be," she said, the words barely audible, but they carried a deep weight. She turned to Grace, her eyes narrowed. "You've made a spectacle of yourself, and now you've made a mockery of my son's wedding." Grace turned her gaze to the woman, her expression unreadable. "No, your son's wedding was a mockery from the start, a parade of wealth, a show of power. It was never about love, it was always about status. You've spent your whole lives building a world where people like me don't fit. But I don't need your approval." The words hung between them, and for a moment the room was still. No one spoke. Everyone waited for someone to break the silence, to undo the damage Grace had caused. But no one did. Grace took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling with the weight of the moment. She knew the cost of what she had just done. She had upended their world, shaken them to the core, and she knew that the consequences would be severe. The whispers would turn into gossip, and the gossip would turn into something darker. But it didn't matter. "Your world is built on lies," Grace said quietly. "It's a world that excludes people like me, but I'm not going anywhere. Not until you understand what it means to be treated like I have. Not until you understand what it feels like to be told you're less than..." The room was silent, but it was a silence that felt different now. It wasn't one of tension or uncertainty. It was a silence of reckoning. The truth had been spoken, and it was impossible to ignore. The guests, who had been so sure of their superiority, were now forced to confront something they had always ignored. The uncomfortable reality that their world was not as perfect as they had once believed. The wedding, which had started as a celebration, had turned into something else entirely. It was no longer about love or unity. It was about power, race, and the systems that had been in place for generations. And Grace had just made them all aware of it. For the first time, Grace felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't going to pretend to be invisible. She wasn't going to let them keep her in the margins. The room, filled with unease, finally started to stir again. The moment had passed, but the ripples of what had just transpired would continue to echo long after this night was over. And as the last few guests began to leave, some exchanging uneasy glances, others unable to look Grace in the eye, she knew one thing for certain. The truth had been spoken, and it would never be silenced again. The days after the wedding were a whirlwind of whispers, stares, and the kind of quiet judgment that only comes when people are forced to confront the cracks in their carefully constructed worlds. The story of what had transpired in that room was now circulating like wildfire. Every social circle, every dinner party, every privileged gathering in town seemed to have some version of the story. Some embellished the details, others tried to minimize it. But one thing was clear. Grace's actions had left an indelible mark. For Grace, though, the aftermath wasn't about the stories or the gossip. It was about something far deeper, far more personal. The wedding had been a moment where she had stood up and said enough. It was a cry for recognition, for acknowledgement of her humanity, of her worth. But it had come at a cost. And she felt that cost with every passing minute, every glance she received when she left her small apartment to run errands, every whispered conversation she overheard at the local store. She had known, deep down, that standing up to the system, to the people who had built their lives on the exclusion of others, wouldn't be easy. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly the backlash would come. She was no longer the invisible woman in the corner. She had become a symbol of defiance, of discomfort, and in some circles of anger. To the people who had once looked at her with indifference, she had now become an object of their contempt. They had tried to bury her for so long, to keep her small and quiet, but Grace had torn down the walls they had so carefully constructed, and that was something they couldn't ignore. At the local cafe, where Grace had once been a familiar, unremarkable figure, she now felt the eyes of the customers following her every move. People whispered behind their hands, staring at her from across the room as if she was some kind of spectacle. She could hear the muttered remarks, the judgment in their voices, even when they pretended not to speak. "Who does she think she is?" a woman said under her breath as Grace passed by, her eyes avoiding Grace's gaze. "Does she really think she belongs here?" Grace's heart clenched, but she didn't stop walking. She had long learned to keep moving, to keep her head up, no matter the cruelty she encountered. If she allowed herself to stop and listen, to absorb every word and every glance, she would be swallowed whole. So instead, she pushed forward, one foot in front of the other, trying not to let the weight of their words bend her. As she paid for her coffee, the barista, a young man with a chipper demeanor, smiled awkwardly. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of discomfort, like he wasn't sure whether he should even be speaking to her. His smile, once so genuine, now seemed strained. "Have a nice day, Grace," he said, his voice faltering as he handed her the change. "Thank you," Grace said, her voice steady, though the recognition of his unease wasn't lost on her. Outside, she stepped into the brisk afternoon air, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe. It was easy to forget what had happened inside the walls of that church, to forget the faces that had looked at her with pity and disdain, as though she was some interloper. But the world outside had quickly reminded her. People were not kind when you dared to stand up to them, when you forced them to acknowledge the truth they had tried so hard to ignore. Over the next few days, the consequences of her actions became even clearer. Word had spread, and though some people had tried to rally around her, offering words of support, they were drowned out by the louder voices of those who condemned her. The stories began to take shape, exaggerated versions of the truth designed to paint her as an angry, bitter woman who had ruined a perfect day. In the distorted retellings, her anger was magnified, her words twisted into something monstrous. To them, she was a threat, a danger to the fragile hierarchy they had spent their lives building. Grace could feel the walls closing in on her. She had become a pariah in her own community, someone who had dared to speak the truth but paid the price of isolation. Everywhere she went, people whispered behind closed doors, their conversations halting when she entered the room. The invisible barriers that had once kept her at arm's length had grown taller, stronger. They were no longer pretending that she was just a background character. Now, they treated her like an enemy. It wasn't just the whispers or the uncomfortable glances. It was the quiet ways in which people began to exclude her, from community events, from social gatherings, from the very spaces where she had once been accepted. Invitations that would have once arrived at her door now never came. She was no longer welcome. The people who had once seen her as a token of diversity were now treating her like a disease to be avoided. It was the groom's family who had started the rumors. They had painted Grace as an unruly troublemaker, someone who had no right to challenge their perfect world. And slowly, quietly, that narrative had taken root. It had seeped into the community, into the circles she had once frequented. And now, it was as though she had become an outcast in the very town she had called home. One afternoon, Grace decided to confront it head-on. She had spent enough time in her small apartment, pacing and stewing in her anger. She had felt the isolation, but she refused to let it break her. She wouldn't allow them to silence her. She had already taken a stand once, and now she would take another. She walked into the town's local diner, a familiar place where she had often gone to have a quiet meal. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, and she immediately felt the shift in the room. The few patrons who had been enjoying their meals stopped, their conversations dying down as they turned to look at her. Their eyes were not friendly. There was no warmth, No recognition, just cold, quiet judgment. Grace ignored the stares as she made her way to the counter, where the waitress, a young woman with brown eyes and a tight smile, stood waiting. The girl's posture was stiff, as if she were afraid of saying the wrong thing. "What can I get you today?" the waitress asked, her voice more formal than usual. "Just a coffee," Grace replied, her voice steady despite the tension that simmered in the room. The waitress nodded and began to prepare the order, her back to Grace. It was then that Grace noticed a small group of people in the corner of the diner, a group she recognized as regulars. They had all been at the wedding, all part of the crowd that had watched her stand up and challenge the groom's family. They had seen her as the problem, as the one who had ruined the day. Now their eyes were full of disdain, their whispered comments barely audible but sharp enough to cut through the quiet hum of the diner. "I can't believe she showed her face here," one of the men said, his voice dripping with venom. "She's got some nerve," another woman muttered. "Who does she think she is?" Grace's heart tightened, but she didn't flinch. She had faced worse than this. The pain of their words had become familiar, like an old wound that never quite healed. But this time, something was different. This time, she wasn't going to let them hide behind their whispers. She turned toward them, her voice calm but resolute. "I'm not the problem here," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. "You are. You all are. You've spent your entire lives hiding behind your money, your power, your privilege, pretending that people like me don't matter. But you've been wrong. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." The group went silent, their faces flickering between surprise and discomfort. For a moment, they were forced to confront what they had been avoiding, the truth that Grace had stood up and made them face. "You're all the same," Grace continued, her voice gaining strength. "You try to destroy me, but all you're doing is exposing your own weakness. You can't hide behind your wealth anymore. You can't hide behind your status. I see you for what you are." The diner was still, and in that silence, Grace knew one thing. She had finally broken through. They could whisper. They could turn their backs, but they couldn't erase her. She had stood up, and she was standing tall. And no matter how much they tried to tear her down, she would not let them. The waitress brought Grace's coffee, her hands shaking as she set it down in front of her. Grace gave her a nod of thanks, but the girl didn't meet her eyes. It didn't matter. Grace took a sip of her coffee, her gaze steady. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer silent. And she wasn't about to let them win. The days that followed Grace's confrontation at the diner were a blur. Her life, once simple and routine, had become a battleground. Every step she took was a reminder of the price she was paying for her defiance. The whispers had grown louder, more invasive. The stares, once subtle and fleeting, now lingered as she passed by, each pair of eyes an unspoken accusation. She had become a symbol, not of strength, but of the discomfort and resentment that bubbled beneath the surface of this community's seemingly perfect life. Grace had known what would happen if she stood up, if she dared to challenge the very people who had built their world on the backs of people like her. But she hadn't known the true cost. She hadn't anticipated how deeply it would wound her, how isolating it would feel to stand in the truth and still be rejected. But the rejection wasn't just from the people she had confronted. It was from the very world she had once been a part of. Her phone, once filled with messages from friends and acquaintances, had fallen silent. No one called. No one invited her to dinner. The invitations that had once come to her door, if not in abundance, had at least arrived. Now nothing. It was as if her very existence had become a stain on the pristine lives of those around her. Her apartment, once a quiet sanctuary, now felt suffocating. She couldn't escape the feeling that the walls were closing in on her, that the isolation was a tangible presence, a weight pressing down on her chest with every breath. The loneliness gnawed at her, but it was a familiar feeling. She had lived through it before, even if it had never been this intense, this suffocating. But there was something else now too, a quiet rage that simmered beneath the surface, a rage not just at the people who had cast her aside, but at the very system that had allowed it to happen. She had spent so many years accepting the role they had assigned her, staying quiet, staying small, doing everything in her power to avoid rocking the boat. She had been complicit in her own erasure, but now, standing in the aftermath of the wedding, of the confrontation, of everything that had transpired since, she realized that the cost of silence was far greater than the cost of speaking up. And yet, speaking up had not been enough. It had opened the door to something darker, something far more dangerous. Grace had heard the stories, the whispers of what had been said about her, how she had been painted as a troublemaker, an angry woman who had ruined a perfectly good event. But what stung more than anything was how those whispers had turned into outright hostility. The rumors had spread like wildfire, and now she was no longer just an outsider. She was a target. She walked into a small grocery store one afternoon, hoping to grab a few essentials, but the moment she stepped through the door, she felt it. The sudden silence, the shift in the air. It was as if everyone in the store had paused, as if they were all waiting for something, waiting for her to make the next move. It wasn't a look of curiosity. It wasn't the neutral glance of someone who had never met her. It was different. It was colder. "Grace," someone said, a voice dripping with false sweetness. She turned to see a woman she recognized from the wedding. She was tall, blonde, and always had the air of someone who believed the world owed her something. Her smile was tight, her eyes never quite meeting Grace's. "Grace, what are you doing here?" The woman's voice was louder than necessary, as if to make sure the others around them heard. Grace's stomach churned. She knew what was coming. The woman, like so many others, had come to define Grace by the events of that day. She had come to paint Grace as an outsider who didn't know her place. "I'm just here to pick up a few things," Grace replied, keeping her tone even, refusing to let her discomfort show. "Oh, I'm sure you are," the woman said, her eyes flicking around the store as though looking for support. "I didn't realize you shopped here. I thought you might have been elsewhere." The insinuation was thick, like honey laced with poison. "But then again, I guess everyone needs to shop sometime, huh?" The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Grace's mind raced. The woman was trying to publicly shame her, to put her in her place, to remind her that she was still beneath them. And it wasn't just her. The way the people in the store were watching, the way they had quieted down as soon as Grace entered, spoke volumes. This was no longer just about Grace standing up to one family. This was about the entire community's desire to put her back where they thought she belonged, in the shadows, unseen and unheard. Grace's blood boiled, but she kept her composure. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, her voice measured but cold. "I'm here because I have every right to be." The woman chuckled, as though Grace was some sort of joke. "Oh, of course you do. But just remember," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "you're not one of us. You can't just walk into our world and expect to be treated the same. I mean, I'm sure you know that. You're not stupid." It was the same line of thinking she had heard at the wedding, the same dismissive attitude that had tried to reduce her to nothing more than a token. She wasn't one of them. She didn't belong in their world, and that was something they would never let her forget. Grace's fists clenched at her sides, but she took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "You're wrong," she said, her voice hardening with each word. "I'm not here for your approval, and I don't need you to tell me where I belong." The woman's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered, her eyes narrowing. "Fine, but don't think that people won't talk about you. We don't forget what you did. You ruined everything, Grace. You ruined their wedding. You embarrassed them. You embarrassed yourself." "I didn't ruin anything," Grace shot back, her voice gaining strength. "You all were the ones who ruined it. You think your wealth, your status, gives you the right to treat people like they don't matter. Well, I'm done pretending I don't see it," the woman recoiled, her face flushing with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Grace replied, her voice unwavering. "And I'm done pretending to be small for people like you." There was a brief, tense silence before the woman sneered and turned away. "You're pathetic," she muttered, loud enough for Grace to hear. "You'll never fit in. You'll always be an outsider." Grace didn't flinch. She stood her ground, watching as the woman walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She knew that this wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The community had made its judgment. Grace wasn't going to be allowed to simply live her life. She had opened Pandora's box, and now there was no turning back. As the woman disappeared from view, Grace's chest tightened. Her heart pounded, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from something else, something far stronger. She had done what she had set out to do. She had broken the silence, and no matter how hard they tried to silence her now, she wasn't going anywhere. The store was still. The customers had all returned to their shopping, their murmurs soft and hesitant, but Grace didn't care. She wasn't looking for approval. She wasn't looking for validation. She was looking for something much more important, her own peace. As she walked to the checkout counter, she felt the eyes on her, the judgment still there, heavy and oppressive. But this time it didn't matter. She had spoken the truth, and no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't take that away from her. When Grace left the store, the cool air hit her face like a wave of relief. She had been pushed, prodded, and humiliated, but she had endured. The weight of the world seemed to lift off her shoulders, if only for a moment. The battle was far from over, but she knew one thing for sure: she had won this round. And as she walked down the street, her head held high, Grace realized that no matter what they threw at her, no matter how many times they tried to break her, they would never silence her again. She was done being small. She was done being invisible. She was here to stay. In the days that followed, Grace could feel the subtle, insidious shift in the way the town looked at her. The glares were sharper, the whispers more frequent. She'd expected the backlash, but what she hadn't anticipated was how exhausting it would be. The weight of being an outcast, of being the one who had disrupted the carefully constructed world of the town's elites, was taking its toll. She found herself retreating more and more, spending longer hours in her small apartment, where she could close the door on the world outside. But even there, she couldn't escape it. The outside world found a way to creep in, through the phone calls, the unexpected knock on the door, the news that spread like wildfire, reaching places she hadn't even thought to look. Grace had always been someone who kept to herself, someone who could disappear into the background when needed. But now, it was as though there was no escaping the attention, no way to remain invisible. The very thing that had once been her shield, her silence, her ability to blend into the background, had now become her prison, and there was no way to break free. The first real crack in the facade came one afternoon when Grace was walking down the street, heading to the local library. It was a routine she had come to rely on, a small semblance of normalcy in the midst of everything that had changed. But as she passed by the corner store, she noticed a group of people gathered outside. A few of them nodded at her, and she nodded back. But there was something about the way they looked at her, something calculating, almost like they were sizing her up. And then she saw him. It was the man from the wedding, one of the groom's close friends. He was tall, his expensive suit clearly noticeable even in the casual setting, his posture perfect, his expression one of superiority. As Grace passed, he didn't look at her directly. But as soon as she walked by, he made a deliberate gesture, not a shout, but just loud enough for her to hear. "That's the one, all right," he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach Grace's ears. "The woman who thinks she can ruin our lives. What does she even think she's doing here?" The words stung, sharper than they had any right to. He wasn't even trying to disguise the venom in his tone, and the worst part was, everyone around him heard. Some of the others stood there, their faces filled with discomfort, but none daring to speak out. Grace's blood boiled, but she kept walking, her eyes forward, refusing to acknowledge the cruelty in their words. She knew what he was doing. He was trying to provoke her, to get a reaction, to remind her of her place in their world. But what he didn't realize was that Grace had heard enough. She had heard their whispers, felt their scorn long before this moment. This wasn't new. It was just another attempt to reduce her, to push her back into the mold they had cast for her. She didn't stop. She didn't turn around. She kept walking, but it wasn't easy. The tightness in her chest, the deep ache of rejection, made every step feel heavier than the last. Later that evening, as Grace sat at home, alone with her thoughts, she replayed the scene in her mind over and over again. The same question kept echoing in her mind. Why did they hate her so much? What had she done to deserve their scorn? She had simply spoken the truth. She had shown them the ugliness they had so carefully concealed. She had broken their perfect world, and for that, they wanted to destroy her. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from an unknown number. "I know what you did. You've made a fool of yourself. You've ruined everything. And people are talking about you. They're saying you don't belong here, that you've embarrassed the town, you've caused enough trouble. Maybe it's time you left." The message was brief, but it hit her like a ton of bricks. Grace stared at the screen, the words burning into her mind. Who sent this? Who was behind it? She had no way of knowing, but she could feel the weight of it, the malice behind the message. It was a direct threat, not just to her, but to her very existence in this town. The idea that she no longer belonged here had been solidified, had been made so clear that even strangers were sending her messages like this. It wasn't just the people she had confronted, it was everyone. They had made it clear she was not welcome. Grace tossed the phone aside, her hands trembling. She wanted to scream, to lash out, but what good would it do? They were right. In their eyes, she had ruined everything. She had broken their delicate illusion, and for that, she had to pay. The next morning, Grace made the decision to visit the local church. It had been years since she had set foot in the building, but there was something about the peaceful atmosphere, the quiet reflection of the space that called to her. She needed solace. She needed a moment of respite from the storm that was constantly raging around her. As she entered the church, the familiar scent of incense and wood greeted her. The sanctuary was empty, the silence only broken by the soft echo of her footsteps. She took a deep breath, letting the stillness wash over her. For the first time in days, her thoughts felt calm. It was here, in this quiet place, that she allowed herself to reflect. It was a rare thing for Grace to allow herself moments of vulnerability. She had always been the strong one, the one who took the blows, who endured the hardship. But today, she let herself feel it. She let herself grieve for the life she had once known, the life that had been shattered by a single act of defiance. As she sat in one of the pews, her eyes closed, her thoughts went back to the wedding. She thought about how they had all looked at her, the way they had sneered, the way they had dismissed her. She thought about the groom's family, how they had tried to erase her, to make her invisible. But even in that moment, Grace understood something. They couldn't take her power away from her. They couldn't silence her. They had tried, but they had failed. Her phone buzzed again, interrupting her thoughts. She picked it up reluctantly, unsure of what to expect. This time, it was a different message. It was from a familiar name, a name she had almost forgotten in the chaos of the past few days. Grace, it's Rachel. I don't know if you remember me, but I was at the wedding. I just want to say that I'm sorry for what happened. I didn't know it would turn out this way. The things people have said about you, they're not true. You didn't deserve any of it. I wanted to reach out and let you know that I see you, and I support you. The words were like a balm to her wounded heart. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that not everyone in this town hated her, that there were still people who could see the truth, who could understand that she had done nothing wrong. But as quickly as that hope blossomed, the harsh reality settled in. Rachel was the exception, not the rule. The vast majority of people in this town would never accept her. She had become a pariah, a symbol of everything they feared. The disruption of their perfect lives, the breaking down of the walls they had built to protect themselves. Grace stood up from the pew, her resolve hardening once more. She knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay here, not anymore. It wasn't just the threats or the whispers. It was the constant reminder that she would never belong, no matter how much she fought. They had made it clear. She wasn't part of their world, and perhaps, for her own peace of mind, it was time to leave. To start fresh. To find somewhere where her voice could be heard without fear of retribution. But before she could leave the church, before she could make that decision, she felt a presence behind her. A familiar voice, soft but tinged with uncertainty, called out, "Grace?" She turned slowly, her heart skipping a beat as she saw who it was. It was Rachel. Her face was drawn with concern, but her eyes held something else, something Grace hadn't expected to see. "I'm so sorry," Rachel said, her voice breaking slightly. "I didn't know what to do. I just had to say something. I've been hearing the things people are saying about you, and I can't just sit by and do nothing." Grace's breath caught in her throat. The weight of Rachel's words hung in the air, heavy and sincere. She didn't know how to respond. This wasn't the reaction she had expected. Rachel took a step forward, her hands wringing together in front of her. "I know I can't change anything, but I want you to know I see you, and I'm sorry for everything they've said. I'm sorry for what they've done to you." Grace felt her walls beginning to crack. She wanted to push Rachel away, to tell her to leave, to tell her that it was too late for apologies. But something inside her wouldn't let her. It wasn't too late. Not yet. The church, with its solemn silence, seemed to offer them both a moment of grace. A moment where they could stand together, not as enemies or strangers, but as two people who had seen the darkness in this town and were trying, in their own way, to make it right. And for the first time in weeks, Grace allowed herself to hope, even just a little bit, that maybe, just maybe, things could change. She wasn't alone after all. Grace had hoped, for a fleeting moment, that Rachel's apology and support would change something, that it would be a sign that the tide was finally turning. But the days that followed only proved how deeply entrenched the divisions in the town were. Even Rachel, for all her sincerity, was still caught in the web of social expectations that had controlled the town for decades. No matter how much she wanted to help, no matter how much she understood Grace's pain, the reality of their world was too powerful. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. Grace couldn't escape them. It was as if every corner of the town had become a stage where the story of her disruption was being played out, each retelling more distorted than the last. She had gone from being a woman who simply attended a wedding to the villain in a drama that no one had invited her to. She had become the problem. She had become the one who had ruined everything. And for all the support Rachel had offered, it was clear that the town had made its judgment. Grace could no longer walk down the street without feeling the weight of their eyes on her. The very people who had once smiled at her, who had been her neighbours, now crossed the street to avoid her, as though she were carrying some invisible stain that could infect them. One afternoon she was walking through the small park near her apartment when she noticed a group of young people gathered near the fountain. She recognised a few of them from the wedding, a couple of the groom's friends, their smug expressions unchanged, even now. They were leaning against a bench, their laughter loud and uncaring. But as Grace passed, one of them, a young man with slicked back hair, called out to her. "Hey, Grace!" he shouted, his voice laced with mockery. "You done causing trouble for the good people around here? Or are you just trying to start something else?" Grace stopped, her breath catching in her chest. She had learned to ignore them, to keep moving. But this was different. This wasn't just a whisper in the corner of a room. This was a direct assault on her dignity. She turned slowly, her eyes meeting his, and in that moment, the hurt and anger she'd been holding back came rushing to the surface. "What exactly are you trying to say?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. The young man smirked, taking a step toward her. "I'm just saying you've made yourself a joke. You've ruined everything. No one cares about your truth. You're just bitter." The others laughed, but Grace didn't back down. The words they threw at her, bitter, angry, out of place, were all too familiar now. They were the same words that had followed her from the wedding. The same labels they had slapped on her to justify their treatment of her. But she wasn't going to let them control her anymore. She wasn't going to let them paint her as the villain just because they didn't like the truth she had spoken. "I'm not bitter," she said quietly. "I'm not angry. But you're all the ones who are too afraid to look at the truth. You're too scared to face what's wrong with this town, with the way people like me are treated." The laughter died down, replaced by a tense silence. Grace stood tall, refusing to show any weakness, refusing to let them push her back into the corner where she had spent so many years of her life. "You don't get it, do you?" the young man said, his tone darkening. "You've already ruined your place here. You're nothing but a reminder of everything that's wrong with people like you." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. "People like me," Grace repeated, her voice rising. "What exactly do you mean by that? Because I'm black? Because I'm older? Because I don't fit into your little world of perfection?" He sneered. "Exactly. People like you don't belong here. You never did." Grace's chest tightened, the weight of his words pressing down on her. The anger bubbled up, hot and painful, but she held it in check. She had already fought too many battles, and she wasn't about to let this one define her. "Maybe you're right," she said, her voice calm despite the storm raging inside her. "Maybe I don't belong here, but I'm not the one who needs to change. It's you." She turned and began to walk away, not looking back, but she could hear their laughter behind her, the mocking comments they whispered among themselves. It was the same as it had always been. No matter how much she stood her ground, no matter how many truths she spoke, they would always see her as less. They would always see her as the problem. As she walked home, the words of the young man echoed in her mind. "You're nothing but a reminder of everything that's wrong with people like you." It was a phrase she had heard before, in different forms, from different people. It was the way they saw her, as a symbol of their discomfort, of their guilt, of their fear. She wasn't just Grace. She was the thing they hated, the thing they didn't want to acknowledge. By the time she reached her apartment, the weight of it all was suffocating. She felt like she was drowning in their judgment, in their refusal to see her as a human being. The loneliness, the isolation, had never felt more intense. And it wasn't just because of the way the town treated her. It was because she had made the choice to stand alone. She had chosen to speak the truth, to expose their ugliness for what it was, and in return, she had lost everything. That night, as Grace sat alone in her apartment, she could feel the walls closing in. The silence in the room was deafening. There were no phone calls, no messages, no one reached out. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had become a pariah in her own home. The world had turned its back on her, and no matter how hard she fought, there was no escaping it. But there was something else, too. Something that burned brighter than the anger or the hurt. A strange sort of clarity. Grace wasn't afraid anymore. Not of them, not of their judgment, not of their whispers. The world had made it clear that she didn't belong here. But maybe it was time to stop trying to belong to a world that had never accepted her. Maybe it was time to leave. She didn't need to be part of their world. She didn't need their approval. But the next day, when she went to the store again, something strange happened. As she walked down the street, a few familiar faces looked her way, but this time the reactions were different. The young man from the park, the one who had mocked her, was there again, but he didn't say anything. He didn't even look her way. The other people she had passed by didn't cross the street. They didn't avoid her gaze. They just looked. There was no laughter, no harsh words, no scorn. Grace couldn't help but notice it. She kept walking, her eyes scanning the people around her. She didn't know what had changed. Maybe it was just the weariness in their eyes. Maybe they had begun to understand that Grace wasn't the one who needed to change. She went into the store, her heart pounding with the unexpected shift in the air. People still whispered, still watched, but there was something else now, something different. The sense of power they had once held over her silence, over her fear, seemed to have diminished. She was still the outsider, still the symbol of everything they didn't want to confront. But now she had something they didn't have, her own truth. She walked through the aisles, her head held high, her steps steady. She didn't belong in their world, and maybe, just maybe, that was a victory in itself. The world they had created, a world of exclusion and privilege, was crumbling, and Grace had been the one to make it happen. One word, one truth at a time. And as she walked out of the store, the world around her felt different, still hostile, still unforgiving. But somehow she wasn't alone anymore, not entirely. The truth she had spoken, the stand she had taken, had become something bigger than her. She wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. The town had always felt small to Grace, but in the aftermath of everything, it felt even smaller. It wasn't just the physical space that confined her anymore. It was the suffocating weight of their judgment, their whispers, their refusal to see her as anything more than the symbol of their discomfort. For weeks now, she had been subjected to the same tired insults, the same empty apologies, the same accusations. But it was all starting to blur together. The pain, the humiliation, the anger. Grace had always known that standing up for what she believed in would come with consequences, but she had underestimated just how deeply it would cut. She thought she had prepared herself for the isolation, for the alienation. But what she had not anticipated was the feeling of erasure. The town hadn't just rejected her. They had tried to erase her very existence from their lives. She was no longer someone they interacted with. She was the problem they needed to solve. It was late one evening when Grace found herself walking through the streets, the weight of the day's events hanging heavy on her shoulders. The silence of the streets felt like an extension of the silence that had followed her for so long. She could still hear the echoes of the wedding day in her mind, the sneers, the laughter, the whispered insults. They had been waiting for her to break, to crumble under the pressure of their contempt. But Grace hadn't broken. Not completely. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Rachel. It had been days since they last spoke, and the sudden text caught Grace off guard. Grace, I've been thinking a lot about everything. I know things haven't been easy, but I want you to know I still stand by you. I'm sorry for what happened. I'm sorry for not speaking up more when I should have. Please, if you need someone to talk to, I'm here. Grace stared at the message for a long moment. Rachel's words were kind, but they felt like a distant echo compared to the reality she was living in. It wasn't that Grace didn't appreciate the sentiment. It wasn't that she didn't value the gesture. But the truth was, Rachel couldn't fix what was broken. No one could. The town had made up its mind, and there was no way to change it. As Grace walked past the familiar storefronts, she could feel the weight of their gazes on her. Every face she passed seemed to look away quickly, as though she were a stain they couldn't scrub away. She had become something they all hated, something they could not ignore, no matter how hard they tried. She reached the town square, where the fountain stood as it always had, a symbol of everything that had remained unchanged, while everything around her had fallen apart. There, in the distance, she saw the group of people who had once been her peers, those who had stood at the wedding, those who had mocked her, those who had whispered her name in contempt. And standing among them was the groom's father, the man who had spoken so cruelly to her. He was talking to a few others, but as his eyes met hers, a cold smile spread across his face. Grace's breath caught in her chest. She'd spent so much time avoiding them, so much time pretending she could be invisible. But this time, she couldn't turn away. She was done with running, done with hiding. It was time to face it. She walked toward them, her steps steady but heavy with purpose. As she drew closer, the conversation faltered, the smiles faltered, and then, as if by some unspoken agreement, the group parted, making way for her to stand in front of the man who had tried to break her, the man who had believed that his wealth and privilege gave him the right to dictate who belonged and who didn't. Grace stopped in front of him, her gaze unwavering. "You think you can break me," she said, her voice quiet but full of conviction. "You think that by isolating me, by humiliating me, you can force me to leave. But I'm not going anywhere, not because you say so. Not because any of you think I don't belong. I belong here just as much as any of you." The groom's father looked at her, his face twisted with disdain. But there was something else in his eyes now, fear. It wasn't the kind of fear you could see clearly, not the trembling hands or the wide eyes of someone about to back down. But it was there, a flicker of doubt. "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice venomous. "You've made a fool of yourself. You've embarrassed us all." Grace stood her ground, her fists clenched at her sides, but she wasn't shaking. "Maybe you're right," she said, her tone soft but fierce. "Maybe I don't belong in your world, but I'm not asking for your acceptance anymore. I'm not asking for your approval. I don't need it. What I need is for you to stop pretending that the world you've built is perfect. It's not, and you're scared of people like me because we make you face that." There was a moment of silence as the words hung in the air. The group of people around them watched, some of them awkwardly shifting their feet, others standing motionless, unsure of how to respond. Grace's gaze didn't leave the groom's father. She could feel the power dynamic shifting just slightly. He was used to being in control, used to having the upper hand. But now, for the first time, Grace wasn't backing down. She wasn't playing by his rules. "Enough of your nonsense," the man growled, his voice rising, but Grace held up her hand to silence him. "No," she said firmly. "It's time for you to listen." For a brief moment, the town square felt like it had frozen in time. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the world around them had ceased to exist. All that remained was the confrontation between Grace and the man who had done everything in his power to crush her spirit. "You can't control me," Grace continued, her voice steady but strong. "You can't erase me. I'm not going to sit down and be silent anymore. You've made it clear that you want me to go, but here's the truth. I'm not the one who needs to leave. It's you." Her words hit like a slap. For the first time, the man seemed to falter. The arrogance, the smugness, the air of superiority that had always surrounded him began to crumble. There was no response, no retort. He stood there, his mouth open, unable to say anything. The others around him looked at one another, unsure of how to proceed. Grace felt the power shift within her. It wasn't the kind of victory she had imagined, but it was a victory nonetheless. She wasn't afraid anymore, not of him, not of anyone. As she turned to leave, she heard someone call her name. She stopped, turning to see Rachel standing at the edge of the crowd. The concern in Rachel's eyes was unmistakable, but this time, Grace could see something else, something new. There was hope there, a flicker of understanding. Rachel wasn't afraid of standing with her anymore. "You were right," Rachel said, her voice quiet but steady. "I've been wrong. I've been silent, and I won't be anymore. I stand with you." And in that moment, for the first time in weeks, Grace allowed herself to feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long: peace. She had fought for her dignity, for her right to be seen, to be heard, and no matter what came next, she had finally won. It wasn't the approval of the town she sought, it wasn't their forgiveness. What she had gained was something much more important: her own respect, her own truth. The world wasn't going to change overnight. The battle wasn't over. But Grace knew one thing for sure now. No matter how hard they tried to push her back, she would never let them silence her again. And with that, she walked away. Not as a symbol, not as the villain of their story, but as Grace, the woman who had broken the silence, the woman who had refused to be erased. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like she was winning. We'd love to hear what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life or witnessed it? Your thoughts and experiences are really important to us, and we appreciate every one of you for being here. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means a lot to us. We value each of you deeply, and your support keeps us going. Have a wonderful day ahead. To let us know you've listened until the end, feel free to write. The truth is always worth standing up for. We look forward to hearing from you.